There is a man this entire city fears, not because he carries a gun, but because he never needs to use one. And there is a woman, quiet, overlooked, the kind of person who disappears in a crowd, who looked that man directly in the eye and told him to shut up. She was shaking so hard her teeth nearly chattered. He had 3 armed men standing behind him, and the entire room went absolutely still. What happened next will change everything you think you know about power, obsession, and the most unlikely place 2 broken people ever found each other. Stay until the end. Hit like. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled.
The
rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, the kind of steady, merciless downpour that turned the streets outside into shallow rivers and drove people indoors with their collars pulled up and their eyes on the ground. By 6:15, the Eastern Heritage Library had emptied out to almost nothing. A retired school teacher dozing in the periodicals section with a newspaper draped across his chest, 2 college students hunched over laptops at a corner table, and Evelyn Hart, 27 years old, standing behind the circulation desk with a cart of returns and a list of things she needed to finish before 7 o'clock closing. The library was not large. It was not prestigious. It did not have the gleaming atrium of the Whitmore Public Branch 3 miles north, or the endowed research collections of the Callaway University system downtown. What it had was a particular quality of silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of accumulated presence, of 10,000 books breathing quietly on their shelves, of wooden floors worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, of radiators that ticked and hissed in a rhythm so familiar it had become its own kind of music. Evelyn had worked here for 4 years. She had grown up coming here long before that. She knew every creak of every floorboard, every draft that slipped through the east window when the wind came from a certain direction, every patron by name and by habit. She was shelving a stack of overdue picture books in the children's section when the doors opened. Not opened. Exploded. The double front doors hit their stops with a crack that sent the sleeping schoolteacher lurching upright, sent both college students spinning in their chairs, and sent the stack of picture books spilling out of Evelyn's arms onto the floor. The sound bounced off the high ceiling and rolled through every corner of the building like a physical thing. Rain and cold air came flooding in behind it. 3 men entered first. Big men. The kind of big that didn't come from a gym but from something older and harder. The kind that made you aware of your own smallness in a very specific animal way. They wore dark coats, and their eyes moved across the library the same way, a sweeping automatic scan that took in every corner and registered nothing as a threat. They didn't speak. They positioned themselves without any visible signal passing between them, one near the door, one angling toward the reading area, one moving along the perimeter wall. Then the 4th man walked in. He was still on the phone. His voice was low, but the acoustics of the library caught it and carried it, and the language that came out of him, clipped, flat, absolutely cold, was not English, though the few words of English that slipped through were perfectly clear. Words like, finish it, and tonight, and I don't care how. He was tall, very tall, and broad through the shoulders in a way that made the space around him seem reduced. His hair was dark, cut close on the sides, longer on top, and there was a scar that started somewhere above his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline. His jaw was set hard enough to cut glass. His coat was expensive. His shoes were soaked. He walked directly to the center of the library's main floor and stood there talking, gesturing with his free hand, his voice rising now, the words coming faster and harder, and the sound of it, the sheer aggressive volume of it, tore through the library's silence like a blade through paper. The schoolteacher had gathered himself and was now watching from behind his newspaper with wide eyes. The 2 college students had gone very still, the way prey animals go still when they understand that moving might make things worse. One of them had her phone in her hand and was deciding whether to call someone. Evelyn stood in the children's section with a board book about ocean animals in one hand and a copy of a first reader chapter book in the other, and she watched the man pace across her library floor, leaving wet footprints on the wood she had just finished asking the custodian to polish, and she felt something she was not supposed to feel under these circumstances. She felt furious. It was not rational. Some part of her brain, the part that processed the size of the bodyguards, the particular quality of cold command in the tall man's voice, The way the three positioned men had already made themselves into a perimeter. That part was telling her in very clear terms to be small, to be quiet, to wait for this to be over. That part understood what was in this room with her. That part had good instincts and very sound reasoning. But she had spent 4 years fighting for this library. She had written grant applications until her hands cramped. She had organized fundraisers, lobbied the city council, stayed late without pay, come in on her days off. She had watched the city cut their budget 3 times in 3 years and had found ways to absorb every cut without closing a single program. This library had a story hour that 40 kids came to every Saturday morning. It had a free ESL course for recent immigrants that met 3 evenings a week. It had a homebound delivery service for 11 elderly patrons who couldn't leave their apartments. Evelyn Hart had held every one of those things together with grant money and stubbornness and the specific, ferocious love that people pour into things the world has decided are not worth saving. And this man was standing in the middle of it, shouting. She set the books down on the nearest shelf. She smoothed the front of her cardigan. She walked out of the children's section and across the library floor toward him, and her legs were shaking. She could feel it with each step, a fine tremor that went all the way up to her hips. But she kept walking. One of the bodyguards near the perimeter wall shifted slightly as she approached, tracking her, but she didn't look at him. She looked at the tall man with the scar and the soaking wet shoes, and the voice that had no business being in this room at this volume. She stopped about 4 feet in front of him. He hadn't noticed her yet. His attention was entirely on the phone call, his free hand cutting the air in sharp gestures, his face tight with whatever was happening on the other end of the line. Evelyn took a breath. "Excuse me," she said. Nothing. The conversation continued. She said it louder. "Excuse me." He glanced at her, registered her as not relevant, looked away. Evelyn stepped 1 step closer. "Sir?" Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You need to lower your voice. This is a library." The bodyguard near the wall had gone very still. The one by the door had turned. The third, somewhere behind her, had stopped moving entirely. She was aware of all of this in a distant, separate part of her mind, the way you're aware of thunder when you're focused on something closer. The tall man lowered the phone from his ear slowly. He turned and looked at her. Up close, his eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they looked at her the way she imagined a man might look at something he had found unexpectedly in his path. Not with anger, not with contempt, but with a kind of cold, precise attention that was somehow worse than either. He was taking her apart, not with cruelty, with the practiced, unsentimental focus of someone who had spent a great many years assessing things quickly and accurately. She was 5'4". She weighed 128 pounds. She was wearing a dark green cardigan over a white button-down shirt, and her hair was up in the kind of practical twist that meant she hadn't thought about it that morning, and her glasses had slid slightly down her nose. She was shaking. He could almost certainly see that she was shaking. She did not step back. "This is a library," she said again. Her voice was quieter this time, which somehow made it more forceful. "We have patrons who are trying to study. Whatever you're dealing with, you need to take it outside." The silence that followed had a texture to it. She could hear the rain against the high windows. She could hear the schoolteacher's chair scrape very slightly as the old man shifted. She could hear her own pulse. The tall man looked at her for 5 full seconds. Then he said something brief and quiet into the phone and lowered it. His eyes didn't leave hers. He said nothing to her. He didn't threaten her. He didn't laugh. He simply looked at her for another long moment, something shifting behind those pale eyes, something that moved through too quickly for her to name. And then he turned and walked toward the back of the library, past the periodicals section, past the reference shelves, and pushed through the door that led to the small administrative corridor in the back offices. The bodyguard nearest to her watched him go. Then he looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back. He looked away first. She stood there in the middle of the library floor for a moment, her knees doing something embarrassing, her breath coming in a way that was not quite controlled. Then she walked back to the children's section, picked up the books she'd set down and finished shelving them. Her hands were shaking badly enough that she dropped 2 of them. She shelved them anyway. At 10 minutes to 7, the remaining patrons gathered their things and left. They didn't speak to Evelyn on the way out. The schoolteacher paused near the desk and gave her a look she couldn't fully read, somewhere between respect and deep concern. and then buttoned his coat and walked out into the rain. The bodyguards didn't leave. Evelyn locked the front doors at 7 o'clock precisely and turned to find all three of them still in the library, stationed at their respective positions, watching her with the focused, patient attention of men who had been told to stay and intended to do exactly that. She stood at the circulation desk and looked at them and understood very clearly that asking them to leave was not going to produce the same result as asking their employer to lower his voice. She went back to work. She finished the returns cart. She ran the end-of-day report on the circulation system. She turned off the lights in the children's section and the periodicals area and left on the low working lights over the main floor. From the administrative corridor, she could hear the muffled sound of a voice. One voice, the same voice. Still on the phone or on another call, she couldn't tell. The tone had shifted, less sharp, more measured, like a negotiation. She was in the process of shutting down her computer when footsteps came down the administrative corridor and the tall man appeared at the end of the main floor. He had put his phone away. He stood for a moment looking at the library, not at her, at the library itself, at the shelves rising toward the ceiling, at the old plaster molding along the cornices, at the painted mural that ran along the south wall depicting scenes from the history of the city, faded now and slightly cracked in one corner but still vivid in its central figures. He looked at all of it with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not appreciation. Something more complicated than appreciation. Like a man looking at something he doesn't fully understand and is trying to. Then he looked at her. "How long has this building been here?" he said. Not a question, exactly. More like he was thinking out loud and expected an answer. Evelyn kept her voice level. The original structure dates to 1887. The East Wing addition was built in 1923. He nodded, very slightly. He walked forward a few steps into the main floor, looking up at the ceiling. She watched him do it. He moved differently in here than he had when he'd come in. The aggressive forward momentum had slowed. Something in his posture had shifted by a degree or two. Still a large, physically intimidating man in a very expensive coat. Still someone she could identify with some accuracy as someone who had done violent things and would do them again, but quieter. He stopped near the central table and looked at the mural on the south wall. "What is this?" he said. "The history of the city. Founding, settlement, industrial period. The woman in the center is Elena Whitfield. She opened the first public school in this part of the city in 1901. Evelyn paused. This building was her idea. He looked at the mural for another moment. Then he looked at her again. "You work here alone?" "We have a small staff. I'm the head librarian. And tonight I close alone, yes." Something passed across his face. Not concern, not quite. "That's not smart," he said. "It's not a matter of smart," she said. "It's a matter of resources. The evening circulation assistant had to leave at 5. We can't afford extended shifts." He looked at her. She looked at him. The rain hit the windows. One of the bodyguards shifted his weight in the far corner, and the old floor gave a quiet creak. "I apologize," the man said finally, "for the disruption." She blinked. She hadn't expected that. "Thank you," she said, because she didn't know what else to say, and she was not going to waste an apology by ignoring it. He nodded. He turned toward the door and said something to the bodyguard near the entrance, and then, without looking at her again, he walked out. The doors opened and the sound of rain rushed in briefly, and then the doors swung shut and the library went quiet. The 3 bodyguards followed him out in silence. Evelyn stood at the circulation desk for a long moment. Then she sat down in her chair because her legs were no longer able to hold the pretense that they were fine, and she pressed both hands flat on the desk surface and breathed. She didn't know who he was. She hadn't asked. She hadn't wanted to know. By morning she would know anyway, because the city was small in the ways that mattered, and people talked. She finished closing. She turned off the remaining lights, checked the locks on the emergency exits, set the alarm, and walked out into the rain. She didn't have an umbrella. She had left it at home that morning and spent the walk to work telling herself it wouldn't rain. She stood on the front steps of the library for a moment, her coat pulled close, looking out at the wet street. Then she went home. She did not sleep particularly well. The next morning she came in at 8:30, which was her usual time, because the library didn't open until 9, but she liked the half hour of quiet before the doors unlocked. the particular piece of the building before other people arrived. She made coffee in the small break room. She checked the overnight email. She was reading through a grant renewal form when her phone rang. The caller identified himself as an attorney from a firm she had not heard of. He spoke clearly and efficiently and without apparent emotion, and what he told her took approximately 90 seconds to communicate. When he finished, she sat with the phone in her hand for a moment without speaking. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "Could you repeat that?" He repeated it. The Eastern Heritage Library building and its surrounding property had been purchased in full the previous evening by the Volkov Cultural Foundation, a private nonprofit entity. The transaction had been conducted through a title company and recorded at the city register. As of that morning, the foundation was the sole owner of the building and grounds. All existing staff contracts and programming commitments would be honored. The head librarian, she, would retain her position and full operational authority over library programming and services. The foundation had no interest in interfering with the library's public mission. She thanked him. She ended the call. She set the phone down on the desk very carefully. She sat for a long time looking at the grant renewal form on her screen, which asked her to describe the library's organizational structure and list its primary institutional partners. She picked the phone back up and searched the name. Roman Volkov. The search results took about 4 seconds to load and approximately 4 minutes to work through. By the time she finished, she understood several things she had not known the night before. She understood who had been standing in her library. She understood, more or less, what kind of man he was and what kind of organization operated behind the Volkov name. She understood why the 3 large men in dark coats had positioned themselves around the room the way they had, and why no one had challenged them. She set the phone down again. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. The library opened at 9. By 9:15, the story-hour children had started arriving with their parents, shedding wet coats and backpacks at the door. The retired school teacher, Mr. Okafor, she remembered now, he was in here 3 mornings a week, came in at 9:30 and settled into his usual chair in the periodicals section. The ESL class coordinator arrived to set up for the afternoon session. 2 of the homebound patrons had called to request their delivery selections for the week. At 10:45, a black SUV pulled up in front of the building. She watched it from the circulation desk. It sat at the curb for a moment, engine running, and then one of the men from last night, she recognized him by the particular way he held himself, the stillness, got out and opened the rear door. Roman Volkov came up the front steps and into the library. He was dressed differently today. The expensive coat was the same or one very like it, but the urgency was absent. He moved at a slower pace. He stood just inside the doors and looked around the library with that same complicated expression she had seen the night before, the one that was not quite appreciation, not quite recognition, but something in between. She watched him look at the children who were settling into the reading circle near the picture book section. She watched him look at Mr. Okafor. She watched him look at the 2 young women from the ESL program setting up chairs. He looked at all of it, and she could not read what he made of any of it. Then he walked to the circulation desk. She didn't stand up. She wasn't sure if that was deliberate or if her legs simply had not received the message in time. Either way, she remained seated, which meant he was very tall from where she was sitting, and the desk between them suddenly felt like a much smaller object than it had previously. "Mr. Volkov," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You know who I am." "I do now." "And," she held his gaze, and the foundation's attorney explained the situation. "You own the building." "Yes." "I want to understand what that means for the library." "It means what he told you. You operate as you always have." She folded her hands on the desk. Her nails were short, practical, the hands of someone who worked with them. With respect, that's a significant claim to take at face value. This library has programs and services that depend on our public status, on community trust. If the perception exists that we've been acquired by— She stopped herself. "By someone like me," he finished. She met his eyes. "By a private foundation with no established public record of community investment, yes." He was quiet for a moment. The children in the reading circle had started singing, a counting song about ducks that bounced cheerfully through the library. Neither of them acknowledged it. "The foundation will release a public statement today," he said. "Full commitment to the library's public mission. Endowment to cover operating costs for 20 years. No interference with programming, staffing, or services. She stared at him. 20 years, she said. At minimum. She tried to find something wrong with this. She tried very hard, because she was not someone who accepted things at face value, and she understood clearly the kind of man she was sitting across from and the kind of organization he ran, and all the rational reasons why this situation should alarm her. She tried to find the catch. She couldn't find it, not in the offer itself. Why? She said. It came out more bluntly than she intended. She didn't retract it. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the same dissecting attention as the night before. This was something else. Something she couldn't name. Does there need to be a reason? He said. There's always a reason. He held her gaze. Then he looked away. At the mural, the south wall, Elena Whitfield in the center of a faded city still being built. He looked at it for a moment. I'll need use of the back office suite, he said. My team will require occasional access to the building during off hours. There it was. Partial. Not complete, but there. The back offices are part of library operations, she said. The administrative suite, the cataloging room, the back conference room, and the storage room behind it. Nothing else. She thought about this. The conference room and back storage were rarely used. The conference room for the occasional board meeting, the storage room for equipment and overflow supplies. Neither was essential to daily operations. She knew that he knew that. Library programming takes precedence, she said. If I need those spaces for library use, I need access. Agreed. And your people, she gestured, a small gesture that indicated the general category of large men in dark coats, do not interfere with patrons. They won't. She looked at him. He looked at her. The ducks continued to be counted in the background. I'll need all of this in writing, she said. A formal operating agreement between the foundation and the library's existing board of directors. My attorney will contact yours today. She didn't have an attorney. The library's board had a part-time legal advisor who worked for them at a steep discount. She would need to call him. All right, she said, and it felt like standing at the edge of something very high and deciding to take the step. Then we'll move forward. He nodded. He didn't say thank you. She didn't either. He turned from the desk and walked toward the back, through the door into the administrative corridor, and the sound of his footsteps faded. He had done it differently this time, walked differently, held himself differently. She tried to name what was different about it. He had been quieter, not submissive. Something closer to careful, like a man who had been told once that something mattered and had, against his nature, decided to act accordingly. She turned back to her computer and the grant renewal form and tried to figure out where she was now. The week that followed was the strangest of her 4 years at the library. The back conference room became occupied, quietly and efficiently, by people she never fully accounted for. She could hear low voices back there during the day, sometimes muffled through the wall, and there were periods when she knew people had come and gone through the rear service entrance without ever appearing in the library proper. Roman himself came in twice during the week, walking to the back without speaking to her, and leaving the same way. The bodyguards who sometimes accompanied him were careful with the space and the patrons in a way she hadn't expected. They didn't engage. They didn't disturb anything. They were simply present, the way furniture was present, except that furniture didn't occasionally check sight lines. On Thursday, a delivery arrived. Not a UPS truck, a climate-controlled vehicle from a rare books dealer upstate, carrying 6 archival boxes of materials that turned out to be a 19th century collection of regional history and correspondence that the library had been trying to acquire for a decade. No note, no explanation. The collection was simply addressed to the library's cataloging department. She stood over the boxes for a long time. On Friday, a second delivery. A check from the Volkov Cultural Foundation, made out to the library's operating fund, in an amount that covered the next 18 months of expenses without touching any of their existing grants. Again, no note. She carried the check to the break room and sat with it in her coffee for 20 minutes, turning it over in her hands. She was not naive. She understood that money from a source like Roman Volkov's carried weight, that money from a municipal grant did not. She understood the optics, the risk, the questions she would be asked by the board, by the community. by the city council when they found out the library's funding situation had changed. She understood all of this with the part of her brain that had spent 4 years thinking strategically about the library's survival, but 20 years of operating costs, a rare collection they'd been unable to afford for a decade. She had 17 children signed up for the new summer reading program, and last month she'd been trying to figure out how to pay for it. She deposited the check. It was on Tuesday of the following week. 11 days after the night Roman Volkov had walked into the library in the rain, that everything shifted again. She had stayed late. This was not unusual. The ESL class ran until 8, and afterwards she usually caught up on administrative work for an hour or two, alone in the building while the cleaning staff came through and the city went on outside the windows. It was just past 9 when she heard it, a sound from the direction of the children's section. Soft enough that she almost dismissed it as the building settling, except the building settled with creaks, and the sound she heard was different. She came around the end of the reference shelves and stopped. Roman Volkov was sitting in one of the small chairs in the children's reading circle. The chairs were sized for 6-year-olds. The sight of him in one, his long legs folded at an angle that looked acutely uncomfortable, his coat still on, his size utterly absurd relative to the chair, would have been almost funny if it weren't for what he was doing. He was holding a picture book, a simple one, the kind meant for early readers, heavy card pages, large text. He was staring at the page in front of him with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the cold, flat attention he directed at other people, not the sharp focus of someone working through a problem. Something older, something tired and stripped down in a way the rest of him was never stripped down. He hadn't heard her. She stood at the end of the shelf and watched him trace a word on the page with one finger. Slowly, going back, tracing it again. She should have turned around. She knew she should have. What was written on his face was not something he would ever have shown her deliberately, and she understood that as clearly as she understood anything. She should have turned around and given him that. She didn't. That one's pronounced journey, she said quietly. The ow makes a different sound than it looks like. He went very still. Then slowly he looked up. His face had closed, locked down fast and hard, every line of it tightened back into the mask she recognized. But she had seen what was under it, and they both knew she had, and there was no pretending otherwise. She walked to the small bookshelf along the wall and took down a different book, thicker, longer, but still simple, a chapter book for early readers, the kind that used real sentences. She crossed to the reading circle and sat down in one of the small chairs across from him, which was uncomfortable in a different way than it was for him, but still deeply impractical, and she set the book on the table between them. "This one is better for adults who are learning," she said. "The vocabulary builds gradually." The silence lasted a long time. "I wasn't," he started. "I know what I saw," she said. Not unkindly, but not letting him take it back either. "And I'm not going to pretend I didn't." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't the cold assessment from before, and wasn't the stripped-down thing she'd caught him with either. Something in between. "You tell anyone," he said, "and You'll what?" She said it plainly, not a challenge exactly. A genuine question, asked in a tone that said she knew the answer, and he knew she knew it. He stopped. She opened the chapter book to the first page. The first line read, "The old house had been empty for years before anyone came back to it." She turned it so he could see. "Read that," she said. "Take your time." He looked at her for a long moment. She waited. The cleaning crew's vacuum hummed distantly from somewhere in the building. Rain came and went against the windows. A car passed outside. He looked down at the page. He read it slowly, haltingly, with 2 stops and 1 correction she gave him so quietly it barely interrupted the silence. But he read it. When he finished the line, he looked up. She didn't say anything about how it had gone. She just turned the page. "Next one," she said. He read the next line. They went like that for 40 minutes, and neither of them spoke about anything except the words on the page. When the chapter ended, she closed the book. He sat back in the small, ridiculous chair and looked at the cover and said nothing. She looked at the cover too. "Same time Thursday," she said. He looked at her. "If you want," she added, because she wasn't going to push it. This was his choice. He looked away. His jaw worked. She watched him think. "Thursday." he said. It wasn't agreement exactly, but it was something. She stood up and put the book back. She turned off the lamp in the children's section and walked back toward the circulation desk to finish her work. She did not look back. She was at her desk, writing, when she heard the front door open and close. She counted the seconds until the engine started in the street outside and the sound of it moved away down the wet road. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She had just agreed to teach the most dangerous man in the city to read. She had done it the same way she did everything, without thinking about whether it was wise, driven by something that operated below the level of strategy or caution, the same thing that had walked her across the library floor 11 days ago to tell a man with armed bodyguards to lower his voice. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the grant renewal form. She worked until 11, and when she walked home through the cold and the quiet streets, she told herself this was fine. Manageable. She was a librarian. She had helped patrons learn things before. This was no different. She told herself this all the way home. She did not believe it by the time she arrived. Thursday came. He was there at 9:15, after the building had cleared out, announced by the soft sound of the rear service entrance, and then footsteps she had already learned to identify by their pace and weight. He sat down in the reading circle with the same expression of a man doing something he had decided to do and was not going to discuss the decision. She sat across from him and opened the book. He was better than she'd expected at some things. His attention was absolute. She had never taught anyone who concentrated with that kind of focused intensity, like he was wringing meaning out of every syllable by force of will. He made no excuses. When he stumbled on a word, he went back and tried it again without being asked. When she corrected him, he absorbed the correction without resistance or embarrassment, which was unusual in adult learners, who often carried defensiveness about their gaps the way they carried old wounds. He wasn't embarrassed. He was too focused on the problem to be embarrassed. He was worse at other things than she'd expected. Not just reading mechanics, there were gaps in basic comprehension that told her the reading gap was old and deep, not a recent thing. Words that had simple meanings he'd never encountered. References that any person with a conventional education would have absorbed incidentally, through books and school, and the ordinary accumulation of being literate in a literate world. He didn't have those. He worked around them the way you learn to work around a missing tool, finding substitutes, but she could see the gaps clearly. She didn't comment on any of this. She just taught. After the third session, he looked up from the page and said without preamble, "You could have used this. What you know." She looked at him. Used it how? People would pay for that kind of information. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the book. About me. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm a librarian," she said finally. "Not a spy." He looked up. "Information belongs to the person it's about," she said. "That's the whole point." He studied her. She looked back at him steadily, the way she'd learned to do in the first week. Not challenging, not submissive, just level. Just her. Something shifted in his expression, slightly, a degree or two. He looked back at the book. "Next page," he said. She turned the page. It was 3 weeks into their sessions, on a Tuesday evening when she had stayed late finishing a budget report, that she noticed she was no longer counting the exits when he entered the room. She noticed it the same way she had noticed one morning that she had stopped lying awake thinking about the deposited check, gradually, and then all at once, and then with a feeling she didn't entirely trust. She was not afraid of him. This was a problem. She understood it was a problem. Fear was the appropriate and rational response to the man and the situation, and the fact that it had been quietly replaced by something else, something she couldn't quite name, that had to do with the way he held a book and the intensity of his concentration and the particular expression he wore when a difficult word finally gave itself up to him, was not something she had authorized. She was still thinking about this late on a Friday evening when she came around the periodicals shelves and found him standing at the south wall, looking at the mural again. He hadn't heard her. His hands were in his coat pockets, and he was looking at Elena Whitfield in the center of the painted city, at the school she was pointing toward, at the children gathered at the steps. He stood there a long time before she made enough sound to let him know she was behind him. He didn't turn around. "She built something," he said. Evelyn came to stand beside him, not too close. "She did. People remember it. The school is still there. Different building now, but same location. There's a plaque. He was quiet. Nobody put up plaques, he said, where I grew up. She looked at his profile, the scar that cut up into his hairline, the set of his jaw. She didn't ask where that was. She didn't need to. They stood in front of the mural until the cleaning crew's vacuum reached the main floor and broke the quiet. She went back to work. He left through the rear entrance. She sat at her desk afterward and thought about what he had said, and about the way he had said it. Not with self-pity, not with anger, with the flat factual tone of someone reporting a condition they had long since accepted. And she thought about the picture book she had found him reading that first night, and the gaps in his comprehension, and the hard, grinding way he worked through every page, and the expression on his face when something finally gave. She thought about all of this. And she understood that something was happening here that had nothing to do with a library or a building or a check from a private foundation. She understood it was happening regardless of whether either of them wanted it to. And she understood, sitting in the quiet of the library she loved, surrounded by the books she had spent her life in, that she was not going to be able to stay far enough away from this man to make it safe. It was not the kind of knowledge that made things simpler. It was the kind that changes everything. And she was still sitting with it, very still, not quite ready to name it, when her phone lit up on the desk beside her with a text from a number she didn't recognize. And the text was a single photograph, and the photograph was of her, taken from outside the library window, from the dark and the rain. And below it, 3 words in a language she didn't speak, and she didn't need to. She knew what a threat looked like. Her mouth went dry. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She set the phone face down on the desk very carefully, and she sat in the library that someone had decided to use against Roman Volkov, and she understood for the first time that everything that had happened in the last 4 weeks had already decided something she hadn't been asked about. She picked the phone back up and stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she typed Roman Volkov's number from memory. She had memorized it without meaning to, the way you memorize things you look at often enough. And she sent him the image. His reply came in 11 seconds. "Don't leave the building. I'm coming." She set the phone down. She looked around the library, the books breathing quietly on their shelves, the painted mural on the south wall, the children's reading circle in the corner, small chairs arranged in a ring, a chapter book left on the table from the last session. She folded her hands on the desk. She waited. He came in 11 minutes. She knew because she had been watching the clock on the wall above the circulation desk, the old round-faced clock that had been there since before she started, whose second hand had a slight hitch at the 40-second mark that she had stopped noticing years ago and now only noticed when she was paying very close attention to time. And she had been paying very close attention to time since she sent the photograph. 11 minutes from send to the sound of the rear service entrance opening, which meant he had not been far, which meant something she didn't fully want to think about yet. He came through the administrative corridor with 2 men she hadn't seen before, both of them moving the way the others moved, that particular contained readiness. He came straight to the circulation desk. He looked at her first, one sweep, head to foot, taking inventory. And then he looked at her phone, which she had left face up on the desk with the photograph still on the screen. He picked it up. He looked at it for maybe 3 seconds. He handed it to one of the men without looking away from Evelyn. "How long ago did you get this?" he said. "About 15 minutes before I texted you." "You didn't call." "I didn't have your number as a call. I had it as a text." He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite frustration, more like a man recalibrating, adjusting for a variable he hadn't accounted for. He turned to the man holding the phone and said something low and fast, and the man moved away toward the front windows. "Have you touched anything else since you received it?" Roman said. "Moved around the building." "I was at my desk. I didn't move." "Good." He looked around the library. The other man had gone toward the rear. Roman's attention tracked the space methodically, the same way it had that first night, except that night it had been aggressive, and this was different. This was work. "There's a camera in the periodicals section." She blinked. "What?" "Installed 3 days ago. Motion activated. You didn't notice it because it's built into the smoke detector housing." He looked at her. "It's ours, for the building's protection." She absorbed this. "You put a camera in my library without telling me." "In the building I own, yes." Her jaw tightened. "We have an operating agreement." That covers programming and staffing, not security infrastructure. His voice didn't shift. He wasn't arguing, he was stating, the footage will tell us when the photograph was taken from outside. She wanted to push back on this. The part of her that had spent 4 weeks carefully maintaining the distinction between his world and hers, the line she had drawn between the conference room in the back and the library proper, between his people and her patrons, between what he was and what this place was, that part was sending very clear signals, but the photograph was still on her phone, a shot of her through a window, in the rain, from the dark. She didn't push back. Fine, she said. What do we do now? You don't go home tonight. She stared at him. I beg your pardon. Whoever sent that knows what you look like and where you work. We don't know yet if they know where you live. He said it the same way he said everything, flat, practical, without decoration. Until we do, you don't go to your apartment. I have a cat, she said, which was not the most pressing objection available to her, but was the one that came out. He looked at her. Someone will get the cat. You can't just... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I'm not going to be relocated like a piece of furniture because someone sent me a threatening text. That's not what this is. Then what is it? He was quiet for a moment. The man at the front window said something and Roman glanced at him and back at Evelyn without responding to the other man. His full attention came back to her with a weight she had gotten somewhat used to in 4 weeks and still could not entirely get comfortable with. 3 months ago, he said, a man who worked for me had a problem with an associate of the Caruso syndicate. The associate sent a photograph to the man's sister. Just a photograph. Her, through a window, with her kids in the background. He paused. She didn't take it seriously. She went home. He didn't finish the sentence. Evelyn looked at him. I understand, she said quietly. Then you understand why you're not going home. She understood. She didn't like it. These were not the same thing, and she had never been particularly good at pretending they were, but she understood the difference between a fight worth having right now and a fight that could wait. Where then? She said. I have a place that's secure. You'll have your own space. No one will bother you. And my cat, the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but she wasn't sure she had ever seen him fully smile, but it was adjacent to one. And your cat, he said. His car was a black sedan, not the SUV she'd seen before, and it sat in the alley behind the library with the engine running while one of the men went to her apartment with her keys and a description of where to find the cat carrier and the food. She sat in the back of the sedan and looked at her hands and tried to think practically about what was happening. Roman sat in the front. He spent the drive on his phone, speaking in a low mix of languages she could only partially follow, and she used the time to look out the window at the city sliding past in the wet dark and make a list in her head of what she knew. She knew the photograph had come from the Caruso syndicate or someone affiliated with them, because Roman's face had told her that in the 2 seconds between him looking at it and handing it off, in the particular tightening around his eyes that she had spent enough time studying to read with some accuracy. She knew the photograph had been taken to send a message, not to her, through her, and that she was a message being sent specifically because of what she had become to him, or what someone believed she had become to him. The question was what she had actually become to him. She did not examine this question too closely. Not in the back of his car, at 11 at night, with her phone in her hand and the image of herself through a window still in her recent photos. There were questions that deserved better conditions than this. The building he brought her to was not what she'd expected. She had formed some vague mental image, a compound, something fortified and obvious. But it was an apartment building in a part of the city she knew reasonably well, unremarkable from the outside, with a doorman who nodded at Roman with the specific neutrality of someone who knew better than to express any recognition. The apartment itself was on the 8th floor and was spare in a way that read as deliberate rather than unfinished. Good bones, good materials, nothing excess. A window that looked out over the city. A bookshelf. She noticed this before she noticed much else. Built into one wall, mostly empty, with a handful of volumes arranged without any visible organizational logic. She crossed to it while Roman spoke to someone in the doorway. The books were an odd collection. A water-damaged field guide to North American birds. 3 volumes of an encyclopedia set, not sequential. J through L, P through R, and V through Z. A thick, heavily annotated dictionary, the annotations in a handwriting she recognized from the margins of his reading sessions. A copy of the chapter book they had started in the library's children's section, its spine cracked from use. She stood looking at those books for a long time. "The second bedroom," Roman said from behind her. "It's yours while you need it." She turned. He was standing just inside the doorway, his coat still on, phone in his hand. He looked like a man who was going to be on that phone for the rest of the night. "The dictionary," she said. "You've been working through it." He looked at the shelf. His jaw tightened slightly. "I read what's available. The annotations are good. You're breaking words down into parts. That's the right instinct." "I didn't ask for feedback." "No," she said. "You didn't." She looked back at the shelf for a moment. "I'll need access to the library tomorrow. The story hour. I'll have someone take you. 8:30. I don't need a driver." "You need someone with you. You can call it a driver." He held her gaze. 8:30. She breathed out through her nose. "Fine." He turned back toward the door. "Roman." He stopped. She had used his name maybe twice in 4 weeks, both times by accident, and she watched his back go very slightly still when he heard it. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." He stood in the doorway for a moment. He didn't turn around. "Don't thank me," he said. "This is my fault." He left before she could respond. The door closed. She stood in the spare apartment with the bookshelf full of annotated volumes and the view of the rain-wet city and thought about what he'd said. This is my fault. Not defensive, not deflecting, just an accurate accounting delivered without ceremony, in the same tone he used for everything. She sat down on the couch. She looked at the bookshelf. She was still sitting there when the door opened again and one of the men appeared with her cat carrier, from which her cat, a large, deeply unimpressed orange tabby named Cardigan, was making his displeasure known at a volume that filled the apartment immediately. She took the carrier. She opened it. Cardigan emerged, gave her a withering look, surveyed the apartment with the expression of someone working through deep personal offense, and then stepped onto the couch beside her and sat down. She put her hand on his back. She sat in the apartment with her cat and the annotated dictionary and the cracked spine chapter book that was hers, and also somehow his, and she thought about the photograph through the window, and the man who had come in 11 minutes, and the sentence he had left hanging in a doorway. She did not sleep well. 3 days in the apartment. The library ran as it always did. She was there at 8:30 each morning, and each evening someone from Roman's people was waiting to take her back. She had established a precise and deliberate boundary around this. They waited outside. They drove her. They did not come into the library during operational hours. Roman had agreed to this without argument, which meant either he thought it was reasonable or he was choosing not to fight it right now, and she was not going to look too closely at which one it was. On the second day, a man named Sasha, heavy-set, quiet, moved like someone who had once been faster and still remembered it, arrived at the apartment in the morning and introduced himself as her contact for the duration. He was not chatty. She was not chatty. They reached a working understanding within about 20 minutes that consisted primarily of him driving her where she needed to go, without commentary, and her not asking him questions about things that weren't her business. She almost liked him. Roman she did not see for 2 days, which was its own kind of information. She knew he was working. She could hear him sometimes, late, through the wall of the apartment, the low-controlled burn of his voice on calls she couldn't follow. She knew the Caruso situation was escalating because Sasha's posture got incrementally tighter each morning, the particular tension that settled into his shoulders communicating things he was never going to say directly. She knew something was building. On the third evening, she came back from the library at 8 o'clock and found Roman in the apartment's kitchen with a bottle of water and the chapter book open on the counter in front of him, and a look on his face that told her the last 2 days had been bad. She set her bag down. She looked at the book. She looked at him. "Where are you?" she asked. He looked up. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. His jaw was darker with a few days' growth. He looked like a man who had slept in his coat. "Chapter 8, he said. She came to stand on the other side of the counter and looked at the open page. Chapter 8 was the one where the family in the story had to make a decision about the old house, whether to stay or leave, whether what they had built there was worth the cost of defending it. She had chosen this book partly for the vocabulary, partly for the sentence structures, and partly because the story itself was the kind that rewarded patience. She hadn't thought about it from his angle until now. "Read me the paragraph you stopped on," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He looked back at the page. He read it slowly, and she listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, "The word you're pausing on is tenuous. It means something that's held together by very little, a tenuous hold, a connection that could break." He was quiet. "Easy to lose," he said. "Yes." He closed the book. He set it on the counter and looked at it. "There's going to be a meeting," he said, "tomorrow. People who need to understand that what happened to you," the photograph, "was a line." He was looking at the book's cover. "I need you to know that because it's going to create noise in the next few days. You might hear things." "What kind of things?" "Things about how I respond to threats." He finally looked at her. "I don't want you to hear them from someone else first." She held his gaze. She kept her voice level. "Are people going to get hurt?" He held her gaze right back. Yes. She had known this. She had known it the way you know things you've been avoiding the shape of, peripherally, without looking directly. She had known it since the photograph, probably before the photograph, probably since the first week when she'd understood clearly what kind of organization operated out of the conference room in the back. She had known it, and she had maintained the line in her head between the children's reading circle and what lay behind the administrative corridor door, and she had told herself that line was real. "What they did to the woman," she said. "The sister." "Yes," she breathed. "I'm not going to pretend I don't understand the logic," she said. "I'm not." She pressed her hands flat on the counter. "But I need you to hear me say that I'm not going to pretend I'm fine with it either. I'm not. And I'm not going to be." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. Not defensive, not dismissive, just, "I know." The same flat, accurate accounting as always. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the hallway. "Evelyn." She stopped. "The Chapter 8 decision," he said. "The family. Do they stay?" She turned to look at him. He was still standing at the counter with the closed book and the water bottle and the shadows under his eyes, and he was asking her a question about a children's novel, and also not asking about that at all. "Yes," she said. "They stay." She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about what tenuous meant and whether staying was always the braver choice, or only sometimes. She thought about the 40 children who came to story hour. She thought about Mr. Okafor in the periodicals section and the ESL class and the 11 homebound patrons. She thought about Elena Whitfield on the south wall pointing toward a school. She thought about a man annotating a dictionary alone in a spare apartment, working through the language like it owed him something, breaking every word into its smallest parts so he could understand what he'd been given too late. She slept eventually. Not well. She heard it before she saw it. The call came to Sasha's phone at 7:40 in the morning while they were in the car, a short call, 2 sentences, and she watched Sasha's face do something very controlled and very bad. He ended the call. He drove in silence for 30 seconds. "Change of plan," he said. "We're not going to the library yet." Something cold settled in her chest. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He turned the car onto a different street and said, "There was an incident at the library last night." She turned to look at him fully. "What kind of incident?" His jaw worked. "Mr. Volkov wants to tell you himself." "Sasha." She kept her voice even. "What happened to the library?" He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Something in her face must have told him that this was not a request he was going to be able to redirect. "They hit it last night," he said. "The Caruso people. Came in through the east side window, the one facing the alley. Spent about 40 minutes inside before the alarm brought response." She was very still. "How bad?" she said. He was quiet for one more second. "Bad," he said. The car turned toward the library, and she saw it before they fully stopped. The east window boarded over already, a city police unit at the curb, and through the glass front doors, the visible shape of overturned shelving and scattered pages and the mural on the south wall with something sprayed across it in red that she could not read from the car, but that she understood was not meant to be misunderstood. She was out of the car before Sasha finished parking. She pushed through the front doors and stood in the entrance of the library and looked. The shelves in the east reading area had been pulled down. Books were everywhere. Not thrown carelessly, she understood immediately, but methodically, pulled and torn, and some of them destroyed in ways that took deliberate effort. Covers stripped, pages ripped in sections. The children's reading circle had been overturned, the small chairs scattered. The picture books she had sorted and arranged scattered across the floor in pieces. The rare collection that had arrived in archival boxes 3 weeks ago, the 19th century regional history, the correspondence files. She could see an archival box overturned near the reference section, its contents on the floor, and from where she stood she couldn't tell how much of it was intact and how much was not. On the south wall, sprayed in red across Elena Whitfield's painted face and the painted school and the painted children at the steps. A word. One word in English. Property. She stood there for a long time. Her hands were at her sides. She was not shaking. She noticed this distantly, that she had gone past shaking, past the fine tremor she'd had that first night, into something quieter and more absolute. She heard footsteps behind her and did not turn. Roman came to stand beside her. She did not look at him. She looked at the mural, at the word across it, at Elena Whitfield's painted hand, still pointing, still directing towards something just off the edge of the frame, the word sprayed across her chest like a brand. "The rare collection," Evelyn said. Her voice was very flat. "What's the status?" "Mostly intact. They disrupted it but didn't destroy it. We think they were interrupted by the alarm response before they finished. The children's books. Most are recoverable, some aren't." She breathed in slowly. Out. "The mural can be restored," Roman said. "I'll have someone—" "Don't." She said it quietly. "Don't tell me what can be fixed. Not right now." He was silent. She looked at the word across the south wall, at what it meant, not just as a message to her, but as a message to him, through her, through this place. "This is what you've made vulnerable. This is what you've left exposed. This is what we can reach. They did this because of me," she said. "Because of what they think I am to you." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She turned to look at him then, for the first time since she'd entered the building. His face was closed and hard in a way she had not seen before. Not the cold assessment, not the controlled flatness. Something beyond those. The face of a man who had looked at something and made a decision that was going to have a long tail. "You said last night that people were going to get hurt," she said. "Yes. You've already decided what you're going to do." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The ruined library breathed around them, all those torn pages and scattered books, all that accumulated quiet presence disrupted and broken and reduced. "If I left," she said, "left the city, went somewhere they couldn't use me to reach you, they'd follow." He said it without heat, without drama, with the particular flatness of someone stating a condition that has moved past the hypothetical. "You're already in the picture, Evelyn. Walking out of frame doesn't make you invisible. It makes you a loose end." She had known this. She had been not thinking it for 3 days with great concentration. "So I have no choice," she said. He held her gaze, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something move across his face that was not controlled, not calculated, not the flat practical language he used for everything. Something that looked very much like the face of a man who was sorry and knew that sorry meant nothing in the specific context of what he'd done. "I'm going to end this," he said. "The Caruso situation. I'm going to end it completely. And when I do, don't promise me things," she said. "Not right now." He closed his mouth. She looked back at the mural, at the word across it, at the painted hand still pointing. "I need to assess the damage," she said. "I need to make a list of everything that's been destroyed or damaged and what it will take to restore or replace it. I need to call my board. I need to contact the rare collection specialist upstate about the archival materials." She said all of this very steadily, because this was what she knew how to do. Make the list, identify the tasks, work through them one at a time. "While I do that, you're going to tell me what you're planning, not the details. I don't need the details, but I need to know what's coming." "Man by chi mashan." He looked at her for a moment. "There will be a confrontation," he said, "with the Caruso organization's leadership in the next 72 hours. And your people will be ready." She looked at him. "Are you going to be here?" she said. "After." The question landed between them and sat there. She watched him hear it, not just the surface question, but the one underneath it, the one that was actually being asked. "Yes," he said. She nodded once. She turned away from the mural and walked toward the fallen shelves and began, methodically, to assess what could be saved. She did not look back at him. She could feel him standing there, watching her move through the wreckage of the thing she loved most, and she did not look back. She had a list to make, and somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part that had walked across a library floor toward a man with armed bodyguards and told him to lower his voice, that part understood, with the clarity of something that had already been decided without her conscious permission, that she was no longer going to be able to stay on the outside of what was coming. She had already chosen. She just hadn't admitted it yet. She made the list. It took 4 hours. She moved through the library section by section with a yellow legal pad and a pen, writing in her small, precise hand, cataloging damage with the same systematic attention she brought to inventory audits and grant applications and every other task that required her to look at a difficult reality without flinching. East Reading Area, 11 shelves pulled from wall mountings, approximately 240 volumes requiring assessment, 40 to 60 estimated total losses. Children's section. Furniture overturned, recoverable. Picture book collection, 60% destroyed. Archival materials. 3 of 6 boxes disrupted. Contents requiring immediate specialist evaluation. South wall mural. Surface defacement, restoration possible, but requiring professional conservator. She wrote it all down. She did not stop writing until she had been through every corner of the building. Roman's people worked around her while she did it. She was aware of them moving through the space, quiet and efficient, photographing damage and making their own assessments in a language she couldn't follow. A police detective came and went. The board's part-time legal advisor, Marcus Webb, arrived at 10 and walked through with her, pale-faced and asking questions she answered in the same flat, cataloging voice she'd been using all morning. "Evelyn," Marcus said at one point, standing in the children's section looking at the scattered remains of the picture book collection, "what do you want to do?" She looked at the torn pages on the floor. "I want to fix it," she said, "all of it." "That's not what I mean." She looked at him. He was a careful man, Marcus, a good lawyer in the modest sense, competent, thorough, not brilliant, but reliable in the way that mattered more than brilliance in the long run. He was looking at her with the expression of someone who had a question he was working up to. "The foundation," he said. "Volkov, do you want me to look at whether there's a legal basis to void the acquisition?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Evelyn, this happened because of his enemies, Marcus. Not because of him. Voiding the acquisition doesn't undo the photograph. It doesn't make me safer, and it doesn't make the library safer." She looked back at the legal pad in her hands. "What it does is remove the only endowment this library has had in 30 years. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He didn't argue. He was smart enough to know when a decision had already been made. She went back to her list. What? By 2 in the afternoon, the library had been cleared of the police unit, the legal advisor, and most of Roman's people. The building was locked. Evelyn sat at the circulation desk with her legal pad and a cold cup of coffee and her phone, working through calls to the rare collections specialist upstate, to the mural conservator she'd found through a quick search of regional restoration firms, to 3 of the 7 board members she'd managed to reach. Roman appeared at 3. He came in through the rear entrance and walked to the circulation desk and stood across from her. He had changed. Different coat, same quality, same darkness, and slept, she thought, maybe 2 hours based on what his face was doing. He looked at the legal pad on the desk. "Status," he said. "Recoverable," she said. "All of it. It will take time and money, but it's recoverable." She paused. "The mural will need a conservator. 6 to 8 weeks, probably." He nodded. "I'll have names to you by end of day. The foundation will cover all restoration costs." "I know." She looked at him. "I have a question." "Ask it." "The east window, the one they came through. You have cameras on the building." Something shifted in his face, very slightly. "Yes," he said. "So you have footage of them entering?" "Yes." "And you knew by this morning, before Sasha told me?" "Yes." She held his gaze. How long before? He was quiet for one beat. I was notified at 2:17 in the morning. She absorbed this. You let me sleep. There was nothing to be done at 2 in the morning that couldn't wait until, you let me sleep, she said again. Not accusatory, just repeating the fact back at him so they both heard it clearly. He held her gaze. Yes. She looked at her legal pad. She thought about what it meant that had been his instinct, to let her sleep, to wait, to manage the information for a few hours so she'd have the rest. She thought about whether she was grateful for it or unsettled by it. She thought about the fact that she couldn't clearly separate those two things. The 72 hours you mentioned, she said, is that still the timeline? Yes. Maybe less. She nodded. She picked up her pen. She looked at the list. Go do what you need to do, she said. He stayed at the desk for a moment. She could feel him looking at her, that particular weight of his attention, and she kept her eyes on the legal pad. The mural conservator, he said. I'll send 3 names. All vetted, all have worked on comparable projects. Your choice which one. She looked up. He was already turning to go. Roman. He stopped. The word on the wall. Property. That's what they think I am. He turned back. His face was hard. I know what they think, he said. Do they know they're wrong? He held her gaze. The library breathed around them, damaged and torn, and still somehow itself, still holding the accumulated presence of all those years and all those people and all those books. They will, he said. He left. She turned back to the list. The call came at 11:17 that night. She was in the apartment, in the spare room, on the bed with cardigan pressed against her leg, and the chapter book open on her lap, though she hadn't been reading it, just holding it, when her phone lit up. Unknown number. She almost let it go. She answered on the 4th ring. The voice on the other end was a woman's, calm, accented slightly, vowels shaped by something Eastern European. She spoke in English, and she spoke precisely. Ms. Hart, my name is not important. What is important is that you're making a decision right now that you don't have enough information to make. Evelyn sat up. Cardigan shifted. I don't know who you are. No, but I know who Roman Volkov is. I've known him for 11 years. A pause. I worked for him for 8 of those years. I worked for him when the agreement with the Caruso organization was first negotiated. I was in the room. Cold started at the base of Evelyn's spine. What agreement? She said. The library, the woman said. The Eastern Heritage Library. Miss Hart, that building has been flagged by the Volkov organization for 2 years. Not as a cultural investment, as a location asset. Its position, its foot traffic, its proximity to 3 major transit corridors. The rare collections, the endowment, the foundation's public commitments, those are real. But they are not why Roman Volkov walked into that building. Evelyn's grip tightened on the phone. The plan was always a mixed-use conversion, the woman said. Public library on the ground floor, maintained as a community anchor for optics. The upper floors. The library doesn't have upper floors, you're thinking, and you're right. But the building adjacent does. The property Roman acquired last month through a shell company. The plan was to acquire both, connect them structurally, and use the library's legitimate public presence as cover for a distribution operation on the upper levels. The room was very quiet. The Caruso conflict, the woman continued, interrupted the timeline, and then a pause. And then something Roman didn't plan for happened. The plan changed. I believe that. I'm telling you this not because I think he's running the original plan now. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what the original plan was. Evelyn said nothing. The photograph they sent you, the woman said, was sent because someone inside the Volkov organization told the Caruso people that Roman's attachment to you was genuine and unplanned, that you were a variable he'd stopped treating as a location asset and started treating as something else. That information came from inside. Evelyn closed her eyes. There's a man named Gregor Lash, the woman said. He's been with Roman for 6 years. He manages the transition team for property acquisitions. He's also the one who's been feeding the Caruso organization information for the last 4 months. The attack on the library last night. Gregor told them the alarm response time on the east side. He told them the camera blind spots. He told them which sections to hit for maximum damage. She opened her eyes. Why are you telling me this? She said. Her voice was flat. Didn't sound like hers. Because Roman is walking into a confrontation in the next 48 hours that Gregor has already shaped the conditions of. The location, the timing, the number of men Roman is bringing. Gregor is involved in all of it, and the Caruso organization knows all of it. A pause. He will not walk out of that room. The cold in her spine had spread. It was in her hands now, in the flatness of her voice, in the strange, distant clarity of her thinking. Why me? She said. Why not go to Roman directly? Because Gregor monitors Roman's communications, all of them. And because Roman doesn't believe Gregor is capable of this. He's been shown evidence before, small discrepancies, and he's explained them away. He trusts Gregor in the way men trust people who've been beside them through violent things. That trust is very hard to break from the inside. Another pause. But you're on the outside, and Roman listens to you. Evelyn said nothing. I'm sending you something, the woman said, to this number. Documents. Financial transfers between Gregor Lash and a Caruso subsidiary, dated, specific. Take them to Roman before tomorrow night. And if I do that, Evelyn said, and Roman acts on it, what happens to you? A pause. That's not your concern. It's a reasonable Ms. Hart. The woman's voice stayed level, but something shifted in it, a faint compression, a tightening around some feeling she was not going to name. Please just take him the documents. The call ended. Evelyn sat for a long time with the phone in her hand. Cardigan put one paw on her knee and looked up at her. She looked at the chapter book in her lap. Chapter 8. The family and the house and the decision about whether to stay. Her phone buzzed. The documents arrived as a compressed file. 16 pages of financial records, transfer logs, a scanned copy of what appeared to be a handwritten note in 2 languages, and 3 photographs of Gregor Lash meeting with a man she didn't recognize at a restaurant she didn't know. She went through all 16 pages. Then she got up, put on her shoes, and went to find Roman. He was in the main room of the apartment, on a call, standing at the window looking out at the city. He saw her come in, registered her face, and ended the call in a single sentence without looking away from her. What happened? He said. She held up the phone. I need you to look at something. He crossed to her and took the phone and looked at the first document. She watched his face. She had spent weeks learning to read it. The degrees of control, the things that moved beneath the surface, and she watched it now with the specific attention of someone who needed to know exactly what she was dealing with. He scrolled through the documents in silence. His jaw was set. His breathing was level. He showed nothing, and she knew him well enough now to understand that nothing was itself information. He reached the photographs. He stopped on the third one, Gregor Lash at the restaurant table, leaning forward, something passing between his hand and the other man's that could have been a document or an envelope. Roman stood very still. Who sent you this? He said. His voice was quiet, that specific, dangerous quiet. A woman. She didn't give her name. She said she worked for you 8 years. He didn't react to that with any visible recognition, or he reacted and didn't show it, which she now understood were not the same thing. The confrontation tomorrow night, she said. She says Gregor has shaped the conditions. Location, timing, your numbers. He was still looking at the photograph. Roman. She said his name and waited until he looked at her. Is it possible, given what you know about him? Is it possible? The longest silence she had ever sat in with him. His jaw worked. Something moved through his face, not the cold assessment, not the controlled flatness, something that looked like a man being required to look at something he had specifically chosen not to look at, and look at it straight, and name what he saw. Yes, he said. One word, the word of someone who has just broken something. She breathed. Then the confrontation tomorrow can't happen, she said, not with the current plan. He set the phone down on the table. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the window, and she watched him think. Not the surface of it, not the expression, but the quality of stillness that fell over him when his mind was working at full capacity. A stillness that was almost physical in its weight. If I move against Gregor now, he said, I tip the Caruso people that something's changed. They'll accelerate. If you don't move against him, you walk into a room that's already been sold. I know. He turned from the window. I need to verify this independently before I act on it. How long does that take? Hours, maybe less. You have until tomorrow night. I know. He looked at her. This woman, was she warning you or warning me? Evelyn thought about the compression in the woman's voice, the tightening around something unnamed. Both, she said. I think, but mostly she was keeping a promise to someone. I don't know who. He nodded slowly. He picked the phone back up and looked at the financial records again. Go back to your room, he said. Lock the door. Roman, not because I don't trust you. He looked up. Because the next few hours are going to be things you don't want to see, and I need to focus. She looked at him. Gregor, she said, has he been with you a long time? He held her gaze. 6 years. 6 years. She thought about what 6 years meant in the context of the kind of work Roman did, the kind of trust that got built in conditions like that, through things she didn't have words for and didn't want them. I'm sorry, she said. She meant it. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face very fast, something she almost missed. Go lock the door, he said quietly. She went. She lay on the bed in the dark with cardigan against her side and listened to the apartment. Voices, low, footsteps. At some point, a door, the rear entrance, opening and closing twice. Then quiet of a different kind. The taut, held quiet of a situation that hasn't broken yet, but is about to. At 2 a.m, something broke it. Not in the apartment. Her phone. A text from Sasha's number set. 4 words. Gregor is in the wind. She sat up in the dark and read it 3 times. Then the sounds from the main room changed. Faster, harder, the controlled urgency of people moving from planning to action. And she heard Roman's voice cut through at once, sharp and absolute, in a tone she had not heard from him before. She got up. She went to the door. She stood with her hand on the lock. She did not open it, not because he'd told her not to, because she was thinking. Gregor had run. Which meant he knew they knew. Which meant someone had warned him. Which meant the woman who had called Evelyn, the woman who said she'd monitored communications, who knew the documents would land, had also, or first, or simultaneously, told Gregor that his cover was broken. Which meant the woman had not been warning Evelyn. She had been using Evelyn to deliver a message to Roman in the exact window of time it would take Gregor to disappear. She stood at the door with her hand on the lock and understood that she had been the instrument of something she hadn't been told she was the instrument of, and that the confrontation that had been going to happen tomorrow was now going to happen on a different timeline, in different conditions, on ground that no one had controlled for. She opened the door. Roman was standing in the middle of the main room with his phone in his hand, and 2 men she recognized and 1 she didn't. He looked at her when she came out, and his face told her he had already worked through what she'd just worked through, or most of it. She used me, Evelyn said. Yes. To flush him. Yes. Which means the Caruso people know their source is burned. They'll move tonight. She looked at him. Where are they going to hit? He held her gaze. She watched him decide whether to answer. The library, he said. She went very cold. They're not finished with the library, he said. Gregor gave them access to the building schematics. They know what we restored and where the security was upgraded. They're going to go back and finish what they started, because finishing it sends a message that you couldn't protect it, she said. That you couldn't protect me. He looked at her. How long do we have? She said. He looked at his phone, at the men in the room, back at her. And in his face she saw something she had not seen there before. Not the cold, not the control, not the careful management of what he showed and what he didn't. Something cracked open. Something that looked for just a second like fear. Not for himself. Get dressed, he said. Get dressed! We're going. She was already moving. She had her shoes on before he finished the sentence, her coat off the chair by the door, her phone in her pocket. She came out of the hallway and looked at him, and he was looking back at her with that cracked open expression still on his face, the one she'd never seen before, the one that was going to stay with her. And then it closed again, locked back down, and he was already turning to the men in the room and issuing instructions in clipped, rapid language she couldn't follow. Sasha appeared from somewhere. He handed her a phone. A different one, a spare, already unlocked. Keep this on you. Different number. If you get separated from us. I won't, she said. He looked at her. If you do, call the last number in the contacts. One ring, hang up. Someone will come. She put the phone in her other pocket. They moved. Sad. The city at 2:40 in the morning was not empty, but it was thin. Taxis, a few delivery vehicles, the occasional pedestrian pulling a coat tight against the cold. The black sedan moved through it at a pace that was fast without being conspicuous. Roman in the front, Evelyn in the back with Sasha. Two more cars running parallel on adjacent streets in a pattern she understood was coordination without being told. Talk me through the building, Roman said from the front. He was looking at his phone, not at her. Entry points. Front doors, main entrance. East side window. Already boarded, but the boarding is plywood, not reinforced. West side emergency exit, alarm connected. Rear service entrance, keypad lock. She said it without hesitating, pulling the building's layout from the part of her mind that had mapped it so many times it was simply a fact. The rear service entrance has a secondary manual bolt I installed 3 years ago after a break-in attempt. It's not on any schematic. Roman looked up from his phone at that. You installed it yourself. The city couldn't afford a locksmith visit. I watched a YouTube video. Sasha made a sound that was almost a laugh. The secondary bolt, Roman said. They won't know about it. They won't know about it. He turned forward again, phone to his ear. She watched the city slide past the window and thought about the library, about which lights were on the automatic timer and which weren't, about the restored east window boarding, about the archival boxes she'd restacked that afternoon in the reference section. And something in her chest was very tight and very focused, something that had burned off every peripheral concern and left only the essential question, which was whether they would get there in time. 3 minutes, the driver said. Roman lowered his phone. He turned and looked at her over the seat. In the dark of the car, his eyes were very light, very clear, and he looked at her for a moment with the full force of whatever he had not stopped himself from feeling. When we get there, he said, you stay with Sasha. You don't go inside until I clear it. If they're already in, then we handle it. You stay outside. She looked at him. That's my library. I know. Roman, I know. His voice was flat and final, and also, beneath that, something that was not flat and not final at all. Stay with Sasha. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said, not because she had decided to obey it, because she had decided not to fight it right now. He turned forward. 1 minute later, the car stopped half a block from the library, and she saw it before anyone said anything. The east side of the building, the plywood boarding on the window, and the specific way darkness sat differently around it than it should have, the way shadow moved when shadow shouldn't be moving. They were already inside. Roman was out of the car before it fully stopped. The men from the other two vehicles converged from the side streets in a pattern that was fast and silent, and completely without the hesitation of people making decisions. These were people executing a plan, or the bones of a plan, adjusted in real time. Sasha moved Evelyn back against the car and stood in front of her, not touching her, just positioned, and she let him because she was watching the library. The east window board had been removed. It was leaning against the building's exterior wall, set down carefully. Not broken, not thrown. Set down. Like people who expected to leave the same way they came in. Roman's men moved to the front entrance and the rear service entrance simultaneously. She could see Roman at the front doors. He had a key, her key, the one she'd given Sasha days ago for emergencies. And then the doors were open and they were inside, and Sasha stepped closer to her and said quietly, "Don't move." And she didn't move. She counted seconds. From inside, nothing. Silence. Then a shout, single syllable, cut off. Then footsteps, fast and heavy, the kind that moved with purpose. Then something that was not quite a crash but was close, the sound of something large impacting something structural. Then a sound she felt before she heard, a concussive thud that pushed the air outside the building, that rattled the plywood board leaning against the wall and sent it sliding flat. And every window on the east side went from dark to lit, a sudden white-orange that pulsed once and went back to dark. She was moving before she decided to move. Sasha caught her arm. "Stop. Something went wrong." She pulled against him. "That wasn't... Sasha, something went wrong in there. I need you to wait. Let go." She said it flat and absolute, the same voice she'd used on Roman that first night, and Sasha's grip loosened just enough. From surprise, probably, not decision. And she was through the gap and running for the front doors. She hit the doors at a run, and they were already open, and she went through them, into the dark. The library was not on fire. She understood this in the first second. No heat, no smoke. The darkness was the normal darkness of the library after hours, the kind she knew. The concussive sound had been something else. She would figure out what later. She stopped just inside the doors and waited for her eyes to adjust and listened. Breathing. Somewhere to her left, past the circulation desk, toward the east reading area. Multiple people breathing and one set of footsteps moving fast in the direction of the administrative corridor, and from somewhere deeper in the building, the back, the conference room, voices, urgent and low. She moved along the wall, away from the breathing on her left, using the shelf position she knew by memory to navigate without light. 8 feet to the first range, another 12 to the end of the first range. Turn left, and she was in the reference section. She moved through it in the dark with both hands barely touching the shelves for orientation, not guiding herself, just confirming position, the way you move through a space you know as well as your own body. She could hear the confrontation in the east reading area now. 2 voices she didn't recognize, a third she did, one of Roman's men, Dmitri, the one who never spoke to her but once held an umbrella over her head in the rain without being asked. And Dmitri's voice had a quality it didn't normally have, a compression that told her he was hurt. She moved faster. She came around the end of the reference section and stopped. The east reading area had emergency lighting, a low, red-tinted glow from the exit sign at the far end. And in it she could see shapes. 2 men she didn't know, both large. One of them holding Dmitri against the fallen shelving, and Dmitri was not fighting back with the efficiency she had come to associate with Roman's people, which meant something was wrong with him physically. And the second man was moving away from them, moving toward the administrative corridor, moving with something under his arm that she couldn't make out in the red light. The archival boxes. He had one of the archival boxes. She did not think about what she did next. Thinking about it would have stopped her. She had been standing at the end of the reference section for years. She knew exactly how the shelving was anchored, the end cap bracket that had been loose for 2 years because the city's maintenance budget hadn't covered replacing it. The bracket she had submitted 3 separate work orders about and received 3 separate promises on and never received the actual repair. She knew the weight distribution of a full range. She knew the direction it would fall. She gripped the end cap with both hands. She set her feet. She pulled. The range went slowly at first, a groan of metal, a cascade of books sliding from the lower shelves, and then it went all at once, tipping past the point of no return. And the sound it made going down was enormous in the quiet of the library, a wave of impact that shook the floor under her feet and sent a cloud of dust and displaced air rolling out from the collapse. The man with the archival box was directly in its path. He wasn't under it. She hadn't been trying to put it on him, and the trajectory took it past him by about 2 feet. But the impact and the rolling books and the shock of it sent him sideways and down, and the box left his hands and slid across the floor, and he was on his hands and knees, and the archival materials were scattered across the floor around him. But intact. Intact. The box had stayed closed. She became aware that she was breathing very hard, that her hands were shaking from the effort of the pull and from something else, from the adrenaline that had been there since the car and had found its outlet, that someone was shouting her name, Roman. He came out of the administrative corridor at a run and stopped when he saw her, registered her, then the fallen shelf, then the man on his hands and knees on the floor, then the archival box. And something moved through his face very fast and very complete. Then 2 of his men were on the man on the floor, and it was handled, and Roman crossed to her in 4 steps and stood in front of her and looked at her the way she had seen him look at things he was assessing for damage, except that the expression underneath the assessment was not flat. "You're not supposed to be in here," he said. "I heard something go wrong. I told you to stay outside." "You did." She met his eyes. "I heard something go wrong." He looked at her for a moment. His jaw was tight. There was a cut along his jaw that hadn't been there before, shallow but bleeding, and she looked at it and he seemed to become aware of it at the same moment and touched it briefly with the back of his hand. "The others," she said. "Dmitri? He'll be all right." His voice was clipped. Cracked ribs. He's walking. She breathed out. From the East reading area, sounds of conclusion. The particular sounds of a confrontation that had resolved. People moving with direction instead of urgency. The change in air that comes when the worst of a thing is over. She looked around the library in the emergency lighting's red glow. The fallen shelf. The scattered books. The archival box on the floor with its contents intact. The south wall was dark and she couldn't see the mural. She was aware of this as an absence. "Gregor," she said. Roman's face changed. "He's here," he said. "In the building." She stared at him. He came himself. He had to. He's the only one who knew about the secondary bolt. He said it without inflection, but she heard what was underneath it. The specific quality of what it meant to be betrayed by someone who knew where you put the locks. "He's in the rear storage room." She looked at him. "Is he alone?" "Now he is." She understood what that meant. She didn't ask him to elaborate. "Go," she said. "Do what you need to do." He looked at her for a moment, the full weight of his attention, not the assessment, not the professional inventory, but something more direct and less protected than either. And then he turned and went back into the administrative corridor. She stood in the red-lit library and looked at the fallen shelf and the scattered archival materials and the archival box on the floor. She crossed to it and picked it up and checked the closure and opened it carefully and went through the contents by feel, in the dark, document by document, checking for damage. The 19th century correspondence was intact, all of it. She sat down on the floor with the box in her lap, which was not a planned thing. Her legs simply made the decision, and she sat there in the dust and the dark with the archival materials and waited. From the rear of the building, behind the administrative corridor, behind the cataloging room, behind the conference room, from the direction of the rear storage room, sounds she was not going to identify. Not long. Then silence. Then footsteps. Roman's footsteps. The weight and pace of them. She knew them. He came through the corridor door and stopped when he saw her on the floor. He crossed to her and crouched down. This man in his expensive coat, crouching on the library floor in the dust, and looked at her face. "You're not hurt," he said. It was almost a question. "I'm not hurt." She looked back at him. The cut on his jaw had slowed. In the red emergency light, his eyes were very pale. "Is it done?" He looked at her for a long moment. "The Caruso leadership is in this building," he said. "Two of them. They came personally. Gregor told them it would be clean, that there would be no response." His voice was completely level. "They're in the front office. My men have them." She absorbed this. "What happens now?" she said. "Now I have a conversation with them." He held her gaze. The last conversation. She understood what last meant in his language. Roman. She said his name and he waited. She looked at the archival box in her lap, at the 19th century documents inside it, letters written by people who had built something in this city and wanted it to last. "When this is over, when all of it is over, I need you to tell me the truth about something." He was very still. "The building," she said. "Why you bought it. In the beginning, before—" She stopped. "I need to know what the original plan was." The silence lasted long enough that she knew he had heard the question underneath the question. Not just what the Foundation's intentions had been, what she had been, to the plan, in the beginning. Whether she had been a person or a variable. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "Tell me later," she said. "When it's done. Tell me all of it." He held her gaze. She could see him working through the weight of that commitment. The full weight of what it meant to promise to tell someone all of it, when all of it included the parts that put her on the wrong side of what he'd originally intended. "All right," he said. She nodded. She looked at the box in her hands. "Go," she said. "Finish it." He stood. He looked down at her on the floor of the library she had built her life around. Something moved across his face in the red light, and she almost looked away from it, and didn't. Then he turned and walked toward the front office, and his footsteps were steady, and the library held its breath around her. All those books and all that accumulated quiet presence and the mural on the south wall. She couldn't see in the dark, and she sat on the floor with the archival materials and the specific knowledge of what was about to happen at the front of the building, and she heard everything, not the words, The front office was far enough and the walls were thick enough that the words didn't reach her. But sound carries in a library in ways that architecture doesn't fully account for, through the high ceilings and the wooden floors, and the particular resonance of a space designed to hold silence. And what reached her was the shape of what was happening without its specific content. A voice she recognized as Roman's, low and absolute. Two other voices, less controlled, with the specific compression of men who understood their position and were working through its implications in real time. A period of silence that lasted longer than any of the exchanges. Then one more exchange, brief, final in its cadence. Then nothing. She sat on the floor with the archival box in her lap and waited. The nothing lasted 11 minutes. She knew because she was watching the time on the spare phone Sasha had given her, watching the digits change in the dim light, which was something to fix her eyes on while the rest of her held very still. At the end of 11 minutes, footsteps. Romans. Then other footsteps, multiple. The movement of people being moved, directed, the sounds of conclusion. The front doors opened. Cold air pushed briefly through the building. The doors closed. Then Roman's footsteps again, crossing the main floor, coming toward her. He came around the end of the reference section and stopped. He looked at her on the floor. He looked at the archival box. He looked at her face. He sat down on the floor across from her. This was not something she had expected. Roman Volkov, in his coat that cost more than her monthly salary, sitting down on the dusty floor of a damaged library at 3 a.m, because she was sitting on the floor and he had something to tell her and he was apparently going to tell it to her at eye level. She waited. The Foundation acquired this building in September, he said, 14 months ago. The acquisition was part of a larger property strategy. This block, the adjacent building, 3 properties on the next street over. The plan was integration, the library's public presence as a ground floor anchor, the upper levels of the connected structure for operations. She said nothing. She had known this was coming. She had asked for it. Knowing something is coming and receiving it are different experiences, and she sat with the difference. The library was not incidental to the plan, he said. Its specific qualities were the foot traffic, the public trust, the community profile. Those were assets. The programming, the people who used it, those were the cover. He said it without flinching, without softening it, flat and accurate, the only way he knew how to deliver difficult things. You were not part of any calculation. You were an obstacle to be managed or removed if management wasn't possible. The emergency lighting hummed. Somewhere in the building, a settling sound moved through the structure, the old bones of a 19th century building adjusting to the cold. And then you told me to be quiet, he said. She looked at him. And I left, he said. I left and I sat in the car outside for 45 minutes, and I told myself it was because you were not worth the complication. He held her gaze without armor. That was not why. She breathed. Why, she said. He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding it. She knew the difference by now between his silences, the ones that were deflection and the ones that were a man choosing words with the care of someone who has spent most of his life not choosing them. Because in 15 years, he said, no one has told me to be quiet. No one has walked toward me when every reasonable instinct said to walk away. He paused. I have been managed, negotiated with, feared, obeyed. I have not been... He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. Corrected. By someone who was shaking. She thought about that first night. The fine tremor in her legs. Her teeth not quite chattering. Walking across the library floor anyway. I was terrified, she said. I know. It wasn't brave, it was... I couldn't let you do that to the library, it wasn't about you. I know that too. Something moved across his face. That was the part that stayed. She looked at the archival box in her hands, at the 19th century documents inside, at the letters written by people who had no way of knowing whether what they were building would last, who built it anyway. The original plan, she said, it's gone. Yes, not because of what happened tonight, before tonight. He held her gaze. Yes. When? He was quiet for a moment. The dictionary, he said. The first time you told me tenuous, and I understood it immediately because I'd been living inside that word for 30 years without knowing its name. He paused. That was when I understood the plan was gone. That was October. October. 2 months ago. She thought about October and the reading sessions, the chapter book, the evening at the mural when he had said, "Nobody put up plaques where I grew up." She thought about the check she had deposited and the archival collection delivered in climate-controlled boxes and the 20-year endowment. The endowment, she said, the operating fund, all of it, that was real. Yes. Even knowing what I'd seen, even after I knew what you were. Because of what you'd seen, he said. Because you knew and you sat across from me in a child's chair anyway and told me to read the next line. She sat with that for a moment. "Gregor," she said, "how long did you know?" He looked away, at the fallen shelf, at the scattered books on the floor around them. "I had suspicions for 6 weeks. Discrepancies I explained away." His jaw was tight. "He was with me for 6 years. There are things you don't want to believe about people who have been with you through—" He stopped. "I didn't want to believe it. But you'd been shown evidence before. Small things, explainable things. You chose to explain them." He looked back at her. "Yes," she nodded. This too was a kind of accuracy. Not the dramatic betrayal of a villain, but the ordinary human failure of a man who trusted someone and worked very hard not to see what the trust was covering. "Is he alive?" she said. A pause. "Yes." She absorbed this. "Where?" "Somewhere he won't be in a position to finish what he started." He held her gaze. "That's all I'm going to tell you." She decided this was enough. Not because she was satisfied with it. She wasn't entirely, and she suspected she never would be. But because she understood the line between what she could require of him and what she couldn't, and she had always been clear-eyed about where lines were. "The Caruso leadership," she said, "will not be a problem." She looked at him. She did not ask him to elaborate on this either. "You said everyone responsible would pay," she said. "The night after they vandalized the library the first time. You said it standing in the wreckage." "Yes." "Is that done?" He held her gaze. "Yes." She breathed. The air in the library was cold and dusty and carried the faint smell of old paper and plaster and the residue of adrenaline from the last hour. And she breathed it in and out and sat on the floor of the building she had spent 4 years fighting for and thought about what done meant and what it cost, and whether the cost was one she was going to be able to live alongside. She didn't know yet. That was the honest answer. She didn't know yet, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, and she thought Roman understood this because he was still sitting on the floor across from her, and he had not tried to fill the silence with anything. She got up. Her knees were stiff from the floor, her back aching. She set the archival box carefully on the nearest intact shelf surface. She looked around the library, at the damage, the fallen shelves, the scattered books, the red emergency glow that turned everything the color of old photographs. She walked to the south wall. In the emergency lighting, the mural was visible. Elena Whitfield and the painted city, and the painted school, and the painted children. And the word the Caruso people had sprayed across it the first time, the word the mural conservator had begun the process of removing, partially gone now, a ghost of red across the painted chest, faded but not yet fully erased. Property. She looked at it for a long time. Roman came to stand beside her. "The conservator thinks another 2 sessions," she said, "and it'll be completely gone." He looked at the mural. "She built something that lasted," he said. Not for the first time, but the way he said it was different from the first time at the mural weeks ago, when it had been a man looking at something he didn't fully understand. Now it was a man who understood it and was still working out what to do with that understanding. "Yes," Evelyn said. She did. They stood in front of Elena Whitfield's painted hand, still pointing, and the silence between them was not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things that had been said and received and were settling into their permanent places. 6 months. The Eastern Heritage Library reopened fully 3 weeks after the night of the final confrontation, with new shelving in the East Reading area, a restored children's section with furniture that was actually comfortable, and the archival collection installed in a proper climate-controlled display case that the Volkov Foundation had funded, along with a small but genuine endowment to maintain it. The mural on the south wall was fully restored by the end of the first month. Elena Whitfield's painted chest clear and whole again, the pointing hand restored to its original precision, the painted children at the school steps vivid in the way things are vivid when someone has cared enough to bring them back exactly. The story hour numbers went up. 40 became 60, became 72 over the course of the 6 months, partly because of a new partnership with 3 elementary schools in the district that Evelyn had negotiated in the weeks after reopening, partly because the library's brief period of public crisis had made it visible in ways that years of quiet operation had not. People came to see the place they'd read about. They stayed because of what it was. The ESL program expanded to 5 evenings a week, with 2 additional instructors, both funded by the Foundation's operating endowment. The homebound delivery service added 9 new patrons. A small media literacy program for teenagers launched in February and filled its roster in 4 days. Evelyn was named library director in March, with a formal contract, a salary that was still modest but no longer required her to count grocery purchases, and an operating authority over programming and services that was absolute and in writing, and had been reviewed by Marcus Webb with the thoroughness of a man who had decided to be very good at his job in the aftermath of a situation that had required him to be better at his job than he'd been. She worked the same hours she had always worked. She kept the same habits. She made coffee in the break room at 8:15, and she closed out the day's circulation system at the end of each shift, and she knew every patron by name, and the retired school teacher, Mr. Okafor, still came in 3 mornings a week and fell asleep in the periodicals section by 10 o'clock, and she still covered him with a newspaper when the drafts came through the east window, which had been properly reglazed and reinforced and no longer let in drafts at all. But she covered him anyway because some habits are not about their practical function. The back conference room was no longer in use by Roman's people. This had happened gradually over the weeks after the confrontation, a withdrawal that was not announced or explained but was simply accomplished, the way Roman accomplished most things, without ceremony, without requiring her to respond to it. 1 week the rear service entrance was in regular use. The following week, it was not. The week after that, it was locked from the outside and she had the only key. She understood this was a kind of offering. She accepted it as one. She saw him on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. This was not formally arranged. It had not been discussed. It had simply continued. The reading sessions in the children's section, the small chairs, the books, and then evolved, the way things evolve when 2 people stop performing the structure of a thing and let the thing be what it actually is. By February, they had moved to the main table, adult chairs, books that were not early readers. By March, they were working through a novel, a long one, dense in places, the kind that rewarded patience and punished skimming, and the sessions ran longer than they had, sometimes until 10 or 10:30, with coffee from the break room and the library closed around them, and the city going on outside the windows. He read better than she'd expected him to by April. Not fluently. There were still words that required work, still gaps in the accumulated reference library that a conventional education would have built, still places where he had to stop and reconstruct from parts rather than simply knowing. But he worked through these without frustration and without pretense, with the same absolute focused attention he brought to everything. And she had stopped being surprised by the speed of his progress and started simply tracking it the way you track something you've decided to be invested in. He had finished the chapter book in January. He had left it on the table the night he finished it, and when she came in the next morning, she found it with a note tucked in the front cover. 3 words in his handwriting, blocky, still in the phase of formation, recognizably his. The note said, "They stayed. Good." She put it in her desk drawer. It was on a Tuesday evening in late April, 6 months and some days after a stormy night, when the library doors had exploded open and everything had changed, that Roman came in at his usual time and sat down at the main table and placed the novel they were working through in front of him and said, without preamble, "I need to tell you something." She sat down across from him. She looked at his face. He was holding himself with the particular stillness that she now recognized as the posture of a man preparing to deliver something that cost him. "The property adjacent," he said. "The building next door. The one that was part of the original plan." She kept her expression level. "Yes, I've transferred it." He held her gaze. "To a community development trust, independent of the foundation. It will be converted to affordable housing and a community health clinic. Construction starts in the fall." She looked at him. "The foundation's endowment to the library is permanent," he said. "I've structured it so that it cannot be reversed, clawed back, or affected by anything that happens to the foundation or to me." He paused. "It exists independently. Whatever happens, the library is funded." She understood what whatever happens meant. She had known for some time that Roman's world was not a world where the future was certain or the risks were diminishing. She had understood this with the same clear-eyed accuracy with which she understood everything, and she had made her peace with it in the particular way you make peace with things that don't offer better options. The legitimate operations, she said. You said you were expanding them. Yes. It takes time. It isn't clean. The transition. He said this carefully. There are things that will take longer than I want them to take. Things I can't promise a timeline on. She nodded slowly. She looked at the table between them, at the novel open to the page they'd stopped on last Thursday, at the coffee cups, at his hands flat on either side of the book. Hands she had watched trace words on a page for 6 months. Hands she had watched hold a picture book in a child's chair in the dark. Are you telling me this, she said, because you want me to decide something? He held her gaze. I'm telling you because you asked me for the truth, and I'm still paying that debt. She sat with this. What I am, he said, is not going to change completely. I know that. I'm not going to tell you it will because you'd know I was lying and I don't want to lie to you. He held her gaze steadily. What I am is changing, has been changing. Whether that's enough, he stopped. That's my question to answer, she said. Yes. She looked at the novel, at the page they'd stopped on, a passage she remembered, 2 characters standing in a doorway at the end of something, deciding whether the end of something meant the beginning of something else or just the end. She reached across the table and turned the page. Read from where we stopped, she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his face. Not the cold assessment, not the stripped-down thing from that first night in the children's section, but something she had watched grow from those things into whatever it was now. Something that had the quality of a man who had been shown repeatedly that he was allowed to feel what he was feeling and was still learning to believe it. He looked down at the page. He read. She listened. She corrected nothing. He didn't need her to. The library closed at 8 on Tuesdays. At 8:15, the last patron, Mr. Okafor, who had stayed longer than usual, absorbed in a collection of essays she'd recommended 2 weeks ago, and that he'd apparently found absorbing enough to lose track of the hour, gathered his coat and his newspaper and his reading glasses, and made his way to the door. He paused on the threshold and looked back, the way he sometimes did, at the library behind him. Good evening, Evelyn, he said. Good evening, Mr. Okafor. See you Thursday. He nodded. He went out into the evening. The door swung shut. She locked it. She turned off the lights in the stacks, one range at a time, and the periodicals section, and the children's area. She left the low working lights over the main table. She made a second cup of coffee in the break room and brought it out and set it on the table and sat down. Roman was still there. He had not left at closing. This too was a thing that had evolved without being arranged. And he was sitting with the novel and a legal pad on which he was doing something she'd taught him 2 months ago, the habit of writing down words that gave him trouble so he could look them up later. She looked at the pad. 4 words from tonight's session, each with a phonetic note beside it in his handwriting. She picked up her coffee. He looked up. In the low light of the library, in the quiet of the closed building with the city going on outside, and the mural fully restored on the south wall, and the archival collection in its proper case, and the children's chairs arranged in their circle in the corner, and 60 years of accumulated presence breathing quietly in the books on their shelves. In all of this, he looked at her. She looked back. She had not fully answered the question he'd asked in April, the one that wasn't quite a question. She had answered it in the only way she knew how to answer difficult things. By continuing. By turning the page. By showing up on Tuesday and Thursday and making 2 cups of coffee and sitting across the table from a man who was working very hard, in the only way he knew how, to become something better than what he'd been. She was not naive about what he was. She had never been naive about it. That was the thing she held on to. Not the fantasy of a man transformed beyond recognition, but the reality of one in the middle of an incomplete and costly transformation, and the choice to sit with that reality clearly, in full light, and decide it was enough. Not perfect. Enough. She thought about Elena Whitfield, about the painted hand still pointing toward a school, about the decision to build something in a city that wasn't sure it wanted it, to keep building past the resistance, to leave something that would outlast the builder's own uncertainty about whether it would survive. You built the thing anyway. That was the whole point. There's a harder chapter next week, she said. He looked at the novel. How much harder? The vocabulary is fine. The syntax is where it gets complicated. Long sentences with multiple dependent clauses. He considered this. Show me one. She took the book and found the passage and pushed it across the table to him, her finger under the sentence. He leaned forward and read it. She watched his eyes move across the line, the slight pause at the clause break, the small adjustment as he reconstructed the sentence's architecture. The subject is the library, he said. Everything else is what happens to it. She looked at the sentence. It was from a chapter about a building that had survived longer than anyone expected it to, longer than its builders, longer than the city that had first decided it was worth building. She had not chosen the book for this. Or she had chosen it without knowing she was choosing it. Yes, she said. That's exactly right. He looked at her. She looked at him. The library held its breath around them, all those books, and all that quiet, and the mural, and the small chairs, and the legal pad with 4 new words on it, and the 2 cups of coffee going slowly cold. She reached across and picked up her cup. Same time Thursday, she said. And he said yes, the same way he had said it that first night in the children's section. Not quite agreement, something more than agreement, something that had a different name. And outside the windows, the city went on in its ordinary and indifferent way. And inside the Eastern Heritage Library, which had survived everything that had been sent against it and would survive what came next, the low lights stayed on a little longer. The feared man and the librarian who had never been afraid of the right things sat together in the quiet they had made, which was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of accumulated presence. And outside the rain began, and inside it was warm, and neither of them moved to leave.